It's great to be here, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out, giving up your lunchtime to hear a talk about Easter, the real meaning of Easter, the resurrection, hoax, or history. But I want to start, first of all, with a story. It's a bit about myself, help you to get to know the kind of person I am, or at least I was. And that's that before becoming a Christian, I was a serious fan of the X-Files TV show, Mulder and Scully. You know, remember all of that? Some of you are smiling at me. And I had an embarrassing interest in the existence of aliens, such that I was fascinated by UFOs and crop circles and all that kind of thing. My friends, my family, they thought I was nuts. And they would ask me disparaging questions like, do you seriously believe in the existence of aliens? And at that point I would simply say, I don't know, maybe, I'm not sure yet, I haven't made up my mind. But I came to the point where I asked one of them, what evidence would it take for you to believe in the existence of aliens? And they took a moment to consider that question, and they said this: even if a UFO landed on the White House lawn, I wouldn't believe in the existence of aliens. Because aliens don't exist, it would just be some Hollywood movie event or special effect. Now I'm telling you that story not just because I want you to know how much I love aliens, or used to, but for a reason, and that's that we all have presuppositions, we've got biases that we come to. That whether you realize it or not, you have a worldview. Whether it's naturalism, deism, or atheism, you've got a pair of glasses that you're wearing, just like I am, through which you are seeing and interpreting evidence all around you. I'll give you an example of that. According to the website miracleskeptic.com, to believe in miracles, self-deception is necessary. It's basically rather insulting because it's telling me that I am insane to believe in miracles, but because the resurrection itself is a form of a miracle, I want to explore this naturalistic worldview right at the start. You see, it's very popular today for people to say miracles like the resurrection are not compatible with science. They say anyone who believes in miracles is naive, that they're uncritical in their thinking, that it's foolish to think that natural laws could ever be contravened, and where is the evidence anyway? In my personal experience, I've never seen a miracle, so they just don't happen. Now, I want to expose some flaws in that thinking, because otherwise I think if I don't deal with that, then all the evidence that I might present to you, you're still wearing the wrong worldview in how you're going to approach it, and it's just going to be dismissed prematurely. So here's a very brief way of dealing with this worldview, and I want to show some of its flaws to you. The first is this, that if God exists, presume that God exists, there must be acts of God. If there is a supernatural, all-powerful God in the world, miracles by definition must be possible. But if you start with the presupposition that God doesn't exist, then you're already going to discard evidence of miracles not being possible because you've disregarded the possibility of the supernatural in your worldview. That's the first point. Secondly, is that miracles don't violate the regular cause of law and effect. They simply transcend the laws of nature. Miracles are not really the suspension of natural laws, but they are more the super addition of something that's not ordinarily in operation. The third thing is to say that you shouldn't believe in miracles purely based on your personal experience. Because if your personal experience is all that you're going by, it's a little bit presumptuous, isn't it? Maybe even arrogant to say that because of your experience has not really had the experience of a miracle in your life, that therefore all experience everywhere, past, present, and future, suggests that that experience is true for everybody else. It's a little bit arrogant to make that statement. Can you really be sure that all experience would support your view? Have you been able to investigate it? Have you really looked into it in great detail? It could be that you've simply only been alive for a short period of time, and miracles have taken place before you were born, before you came into existence, and they may take place after you came into existence, or that they're taking place geographically in different locations around the world that you're not observing. Or it could simply be that because of your worldview, that even if a miracle did take place, you would disregard it in the same way that my friend would disregard the existence of aliens from a UFO landing on the White House lawn. Now, it's worth mentioning here that greater evidence doesn't necessarily mean, as the English skeptic Hume once said, that it has to be more regular evidence. The more something is repeated, the more likely it is to happen. That's not the only kind of evidence that exists. Otherwise, we would say that rare events would never happen. They're never possible at all. See, there is a difference between adding up evidence and weighing the evidence. Give an example of this. Say you won the lottery. Wonderful thing. If you won the lottery, great. You're suddenly rich. You can give up your medical career and go and have fun. Don't do that. For say you won the lottery, but you might conclude that you could never have won the lottery because you are adding up the evidence. Because of the thousands upon thousands of people who failed to win the lottery. They failed to win the lottery. Therefore, even though you have won the lottery, you would conclude you could not have won the lottery because of everybody else who failed it. You see, there is a difference between adding evidence and weighing the evidence. My point really is, what I'm saying is that you're unlikely to be able to see a miracle or to even consider objectively the evidence for and against the resurrection if you're approaching it with the wrong worldview, the wrong pair of glasses. Let me put it this way. Imagine that you are a bloke. You have applied for a job and you get selected for interview, you're going for the interview, and you hear on the grapevine that your interviewer is biased towards attractive young women and towards his niece in particular. Now, how do you feel as you go to that interview? You know the deck is stacked against you. You're very unlikely to get a fair hearing at that job interview. So as we come to the evidence of the resurrection, I just want to encourage you right at the outset not to allow any presuppositions or prejudices to stop you from really giving the evidence a fair hearing. Now, before we get into the case in more detail, there's one more initial objection I want to say about the nature and quality of evidence. I've touched on it a little bit with this whole adding and weighing of evidence. My question really is this to you. How do you know something? How do you know that you know something? What evidence is there that would satisfy you of that? I'll give you an example of this. Say, I want to know for sure whether or not my wife loves me. She tells me she loves me. How do I know that she loves me? Now, I may be the kind of husband that says, okay, I'm not sure, honey, Holly, were you really telling me the truth? I'm going to wire you up to some machines to find out. When you tell me you love me, I'm going to measure your heart rate. And so I've got her plugged in, going to measure her skin conductance, the sweat response, all of that, her brain activity, what's going on. Now, knowing my wife, immediately our marriage may be under consideration in her point at that moment in time. But I'm not sure what evidence that's going to produce that's going to help me. So how do I know? What other evidence is there I could look to help me know whether or not she's telling the truth when she tells me she loves me? Well, it might be things like the fact that she'll laugh at my really bad jokes, for example. I'm not sure many women would do that. Also, it might be that she's willing to still sleep with a man who smells and snores. These are the kind of things, and of course, many, many more in our relationship that I could go to and say, I can have a reasonable faith that when she tells me that she loves me, she's telling me the truth. Because ultimately it is a matter of faith. So much is a matter of faith in life. Right now you're sitting on a chair by faith that is holding you up. You've put faith in the chair that you're sat on. You know nothing about its construction. You were not there when it was made, yet you sat on it. You didn't probably take a moment's thought that it would hold your weight. When you get on a plane, you act in faith. Faith in the carriage of that its construction, that it's the right plane, that it's built well, that the pilots and the co-pilot are going to do the right thing. But I think Malaysian flight MH370 would tell you otherwise today. You might question your faith when you get on board. There's a faith that when you get on board a plane, it will reach its destination. Everything is a matter of faith. Now, by saying that, I'm of course not ruling out evidence altogether. I'm just saying that there is a different kind of evidence to mathematical and scientific and philosophical evidence when we come to the case of the resurrection. I'm a great believer in evidence. Now, I studied law and I practiced law for nearly 8 years. So for me, evidence is important. I was a criminal barrister. I love evidence and arguing and interpreting it. So I just couldn't blindly believe in the resurrection just as a matter of fact. I'd need to have evidence from which I can take a reasonable faith to believe that the resurrection is possible. And the kind of evidence that we're looking at here is more like historical evidence, the sort of evidence that you would put before a judge or a jury. And this evidence has persuaded a great number of super legal minds. I'll give you just 2 examples of that. The first would be Simon Greenleaf. He was the Royal Professor of Law at Harvard, and he wrote a famous work called A Treatise on the Law of Evidence. It's still read today, and he strongly believed in the case for the resurrection. There's also a barrister, an English barrister, called Frank Morrison, who is very against Christianity. He set his stall in writing a book to disprove the resurrection. What happened is he discovered the evidence, he became a believer, he believed in the case for the resurrection, and you could read his book today called Who Moved the Stone? So we're going to look at the evidence together. Simply 5 facts for the case for the resurrection. Fact number 1 is that Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus died by crucifixion. My first piece of evidence for that would be the canonical Gospels, the first 4 books of the Bible, which all assert that Jesus died by crucifixion. Now, Some of you may have questions about that. How can you put forward a book that is believed to be the inspired word of God? Well, I'm not asking you to accept that it is the inspired word of God, to accept the point that it says in there that Jesus died by crucifixion. I really only want to treat the Scriptures as an ancient historical document. And like any historian would come to it and look at it and see and read it credibly and argue and see, is it a true, reliable historical source on that issue of whether Jesus died by crucifixion? And the majority, really even skeptical historians, would say, yes, we accept it is evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion. Not only that, but this is supported by non-Christian secular sources, people who are hostile to the Christian faith. Let me give you three. The first of these is a man called Josephus. He was a Jewish historian, and his writings are believed to have been tampered with. But the best reconstruction we have of what he wrote, he lived from 37 to 100 AD, so it's very close to the time of Jesus' death and resurrection. He wrote this. He says, when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. Lucian, he lived from 115 to 200 AD. He was a Greek satirist, again, not a Christian. He wrote this, the one whom they still worship today, the man in Palestine who was crucified because he brought this new form of initiation into the world. Or Tacitus, a Roman historian, he lived from 56 to 100 AD, to 120 AD, and he wrote this. Nero, who's the emperor, Roman emperor at the time, fastened the guilt of the burning of Rome and inflicted the exquisite tortures on the class hated for their abominations, called the Christians by the populace. Christus, talking about Jesus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So that's the first point. Really, it's very hard to argue with the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number one. Fact number two, Jesus' disciples believed Jesus rose from the dead. They both claimed it and they believed it. Now, there are a number of sources I could go to support that fact, but the best, I think, and the most credible one is the early oral tradition. Now, this would mean that there was early oral tradition, creeds or statements that were going around the early church, that they were sharing verbally to one another, that then when the New Testament writers came to write, they quoted those and put them in their writings in the New Testament. So it means these creeds were around before the New Testament was written. A very good example of this is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8. It's a quotation of an early creed in a letter that Paul wrote to a church in Corinth. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He writes this, "For I delivered to you of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." By that he means that they've died. "Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me." Now, several factors here suggest that that Paul was quoting an oral tradition. First, he talked about language of it being delivered to him and received. So he's quoting something else, not his own writing here. Also, the language that is used, there's the word Cephas, which is an Aramaic word. It's the name for Peter. And there are other Aramaic words within this creed. And that would make sense because the primary language that the very first Christians spoke was Aramaic. And so because of that, it suggests again that it's early oral tradition. Add to that the fact that there are non-Pauline words or phraseology in it, and stylistically, it's not of Paul. It looks different to his normal writings. All of that suggests it's an earlier creed that's being quoted here. So when did he hear about this? When did Paul hear this oral tradition that was passed on to him that he was sharing with the Corinthian church? Well, most likely, really three options. The first option is he received it when he became a Christian. On the road to Damascus, the Damascus Christians taught him this creed. So very, very close, literally years after the resurrection, after Jesus had died. Second option is that he received it, according to Galatians chapter 1, when he went to Jerusalem himself to speak with the apostles who claimed to have seen the risen Jesus. And it's at that point, which is about 5 years or so, 3 to 5 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, that he would have received that and taken it on. Now, even the skeptical historians would argue that you can't have a date beyond AD 51 for this early creed, because it's generally accepted that in AD 51 that Paul visited the church in Corinth. And then he writes a letter later, AD 53 to 57, saying to the church in Corinth, when I visited you, which would have been AD 51, I told you about this creed which had been given earlier. So you've got here something very early taking place, very early evidence for the resurrection. And that's significant for a couple of reasons. First reason it's significant is it really destroys any argument that the resurrection is legendary, that it was corrupted or embellished, because you have it very, very early on that the original people to whom they saw the resurrected Jesus are making this claim right at the outset. And we've got evidence of that through this creed. So you can't really argue that it was embellished easily later on. The second thing is the nature of the creed itself. The creed itself talks about Jesus appearing to not just individuals or a group of, say, 12 people, but to 500 people at the same time. And Paul here is deliberately inviting anybody who doubts the resurrection at the time that he was writing to go and speak to these eyewitnesses. He's saying these people are alive. You can go, there's Pax Romana, you can travel around, you can go and visit these individuals and ask them for yourselves as eyewitnesses whether or not this is true. Now, he would not allow that to happen if he didn't think these eyewitnesses would corroborate the truth of having seen the resurrected Jesus. And finally, there are the claims here in the four Gospels written about 70 years within Jesus' death, from the point of Jesus' death. Four Gospels that are written there, and then you have the claims that they're made in those Gospels about Jesus being raised from the dead by the disciples. They're making those claims, which are then supported by those later in church history, the apostolic fathers like Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who's a disciple of John, who is saying, yes, these disciples, they did make this claim that they had seen the risen Jesus raised from the dead. Now, admittedly, you could say there are some differences in the accounts in the Gospels, the four Gospels, about the resurrection. You've probably heard that, haven't you? You know, people say, skeptics, there are contradictions in these Gospel accounts that really undermine their credibility. Let me say a little bit about that. First is that no really reliable, credible historian would say that because there are contradictions in accounts, the main premise of what's being argued for in the account is destroyed or lost. Otherwise, all history really would begin to fall apart, because obviously there will be contradictions in how people report the same event taking place. But consider the Titanic, the tragic disaster of the Titanic that sank in 1912. I don't know if you know this, but there are different accounts of how the Titanic sank. So some survivors would say that they saw the Titanic break into two before it went down and sank. Other survivors say it was in one, it went on its sides like that, one end down, and it went all the way down like that. Which is correct. How could they get it wrong? How could they have that contradiction? Now, here's a ship, it's emblazoned with light, there's people screaming, coming from it, you're sat in a life raft, how do you get that wrong? I don't know. You may have some ideas about how you could make that mistake yourself. But the point is that no credible historian would say the Titanic didn't sink, because there are contradictory accounts here taking place. Why? Because the contradictions are peripheral to the main event that's being described. They're all saying that the Titanic sank, they're disagreeing about how it happened. And the same is true in the Gospel accounts. They're all saying that Jesus was raised from the dead, that he appeared to people, but there may be some things that are differences in how that's being reported. Now, that's not to say that I necessarily believe that there are contradictions that cannot be reconciled in the Scriptures. I think a lot of them, when you give them closer study and examination, you can discover that actually there is a way that they can marry and work together. I'll give you just one example of that. That's the time of the visit to the tomb. When did that take place? Well, John in his Gospel, he says that it was still dark at the time. Mark and Luke in their Gospels say it was getting light. I don't know about you, but for me it's a bit like if you're an optimist and or a pessimist arguing together about whether a glass is half full or if it's half empty. You see, they're effectively describing the same thing from a different point of view. It was dawn. It was the beginning of a new day. It was still dark, but it was beginning to get light. That's how a great deal, I believe, of these alleged contradictions can, in fact, be reconciled. But also, if you had really very similar, almost identical accounts being reported, and no differences in the details, you would presume from that there had been collaboration, that this had been an invention of people getting together in their evidence. I don't want to be disparaging on videotape about certain individuals and some of the cases that I've tried, but there is a particular service that's provided in our country where sometimes you recognise that the evidence that's being put forward when you're defending a case is rather similar, that two witnesses seem to have been talking to each other and that they've almost got identical evidence, and you know then when you're defending that as a barrister that you've got a problem. And really you're no longer dealing with multiple witnesses, you're dealing with one witness because they've all got together and colluded about their evidence. We don't have that. We have multiple independent witnesses to the resurrection in the gospel accounts. So we know they claimed it. They claimed that Jesus rose from the dead, but they also believed this. They believed it. It's been well documented. The transformation in Jesus' followers from being people who were afraid, they were scared. They denied Jesus, and suddenly, through having seen him appear, they're willing to die for him, to risk being hurt, beaten, cruel torture that they would face. They did all of that. They would boldly go forward and proclaim this Jesus risen from the dead, drawing thousands to faith, with the birth of the church coming about as a result, which is still here today. And that's important because you can't really just deny that the resurrection took place. You can't say, the resurrection didn't happen, that's it. You have to come up with an alternative theory for how it happened. You have to be able to explain, why is the church here? What happened? All those hundreds of years ago, what happened? Why is the church still here today? Now, okay, you might argue here that, yes, the fact that they died for what they believed really is only support for the sincerity of their belief. Yes, that's right. It doesn't necessarily prove the veracity, the truthfulness of what they believed. And we know of examples today, don't we? Muslim terrorists or Buddhists who might kill themselves because they sincerely believe what they've been told or taught. But there's a really big distinction here that I want to draw to your attention, and it's the distinction between the modern martyrs today and the early apostle martyrs, the first martyrs in the church. You see, modern martyrs today, they would die for what they have been told on the basis that they believe that is the truth. The early martyrs, the people who saw Jesus firsthand, were dying because they personally believed they had really seen him. Do you see the difference? They had actually seen him, so they died for that. They're not dying for something that's been passed on to them. Fact number 3 is the conversion of the church persecutor Paul. So the story of Saul of Tarsus, who's a persecutor of the church, who's trying to destroy the Christian faith. How does he become Paul, the great proclaimer of the Christian faith? How does that happen? How does a man who's totally hostile to Jesus, who's wanting to take away Christians, to have them killed, to purge Christianity off the face of the earth, how does he suddenly totally have his whole thinking turned around that he would willingly be beheaded in Rome for preaching the gospel? Well, the only satisfactory explanation I know for that is that he must have seen the risen Jesus. He knew Jesus had been crucified. He sees him risen, and it changes his total worldview. The fourth fact is the conversion of the skeptic James. So Jesus' half-brother, James, didn't believe in Jesus at all prior to the resurrection. He was skeptical. He doubted. He didn't accept his claim to be the Son of God. Yet we know from this early creed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that Jesus appeared to him. And we're told in the Gospels and in church history that he became a leader in the church. In fact, both Christian and non-Christian sources tell us that he died as a martyr. So how does someone who's very skeptical about Jesus become a great church leader, someone who's willing to die for him? Again, the only satisfactory explanation I know is that he must have seen the risen Jesus. What else would persuade him to change his thinking? The final fact that I have is the empty tomb. Fact number 5. See, where there should have been an embalmed body wrapped in grave clothes, there was like a cocooned chrysalis of grave clothes, almost as if the body had moved through those grave clothes. That's what's been described by John when he walks into this scene in the Gospel. He's so overwhelmed by this that he almost immediately has faith on seeing the grave clothes alone. So if the resurrection was a hoax, where's the body? Why is the tomb empty? You see, if Christianity was to survive, the only way it could survive was if there was an empty tomb. Because all the authorities would have had to do was said, go and look in the tomb, he's there. Or saving that, they could say, here is his body. Let me show you, let me prove to you that he can't be alive. They could have even brought a fake body out that was still wrapped in grave clothes and pretended that that was Jesus. And it would have dispelled at least some of the belief about him. But they didn't do that. Do you know what they did? Well, the gospel writers and the early church historians record what had happened. And they said that the Jewish authorities created a lie that Jesus' disciples had stolen his body. But think about that for a moment. Why would you create a lie that the body has been stolen if the tomb is not empty? If you know where the body is, if this is all a fake and a hoax, you wouldn't need to create the lie. So you have the very enemies against the gospel really indirectly affirming that the tomb was empty. Now, before we take some time for questions, many have attempted to explain away some of these facts and come up with alternative theories of their own. And I think the desire to try and explain the facts is significant, because if the resurrection really is true, it means if you're not a Christian, you've got a lot of adjusting to do. So for sake of time, I'm going to take on three popular alternative theories. The first is fraud. So some would say that the disciples lied. They made this up. They stole the body, or somebody else, some thieves, stole the body. It's a hoax. It's a sham. Now, if the disciples had really invented the resurrection, I think they should have done a better job. So maybe it's because I'm a lawyer, maybe it's because I'm a bit of a nasty kind of person who knows how to tell lies, but I certainly would not have put together 4 kind of jigsaw puzzle gospel accounts that are a little bit confusing and kind of marrying them together so you have to work out what's going on. That's for starters. I definitely would have included any mention of fears or doubts in the accounts, especially my own personal ones, because I find that undermining. That would embarrass me in front of not just my peers, but the rest of the world who would read about this. But beyond that, I would also definitely want to include some kind of account of the actual resurrection itself. Some kind of amazing explanation of how Jesus broke through the bonds of death and he raised and was appeared triumphant, that whole process of how that happened. Yet we don't see that at all. There's absolutely no mention of that in the gospel itself. The actual process of resurrection is not included. But to add to all of that, I would never have included, no offense to women here, I would never have included women as the first witnesses to the resurrection. Because in that day and age, women's evidence was considered worthless. The Jewish Talmud says that a woman's evidence was regarded as the same as that of a robber. Obviously that's highly inappropriate today, but in that day that was the consideration of the evidence. You just wouldn't have included that. All these factors suggest that what you've got here is a genuine account. But add to that the disciples, they sincerely believed that they'd seen the risen Jesus. They're willing to die for it. 10 out of the 12 disciples actually are martyred in fairly brutal ways because they believed this. Now, can you really conceive that they would perpetuate a lie that would cost them everything, including their lives? I don't know about you, but I do not think hypocrites make good martyrs. Now, contrast that with Mormonism. Contrast the 12 disciples with the early founders of Mormonism. Because 6 of the 11 witnesses to the gold plates, which were allegedly sort of translated by Joseph Smith to become the Book of Mormon, 6 of the 11 rejected it and left the church, the Mormon church. Yet the disciples here, they continued to believe in Jesus to their dying breath. They did not turn away from him. Moreover, the dishonesty here this fraud idea doesn't explain the conversion of Paul or James. Paul was hostile, James was a skeptic. They were on the lookout for fraud, for hoax, for fakes. Yet they were so persuaded that their whole worldview and outlook changed. Good example of this whole idea of why hoax doesn't work comes from the Watergate scandal, 1972 to 1973. You're all too young to really probably have great memories of that, but hopefully you know a little bit about it. Watergate was a scandal, a cover-up conspiracy to cover up dirty tricks and tactics that were going on in the Nixon administration by some of his closest aides and loyal confidants. One of them was a guy called John Dean. And he went to Nixon and told him everything that was going on. He fessed up to Nixon. But it only took him 2 weeks to fess up to all the authorities. They could only keep this cover-up under wraps for 2 weeks before he wanted to tell the authorities why. He says to save his own skin. And at that point, everybody else jumped ship to confess all to the authorities to save their own skin. They could only keep this contained for just 2 weeks, this hoax. Now, when you think of the disciples here, they faced so much more than Nixon's aides. All of Nixon's aides, they might have faced embarrassment, they might have faced maybe even imprisonment, but the disciples here were risking everything, their lives, stonings, beatings, floggings, execution. So you'd think that if they were lying, if this was a hoax, they might crack under pressure and confess all, that they might just tell the authorities, let me get out of jail free card, to save my own skin, let me tell everybody everything if it was a fake. Yet again, I say, they kept their confession. Jesus was raised from the dead to their dying breath. Next then is it possible that someone other than the disciples stole the body? Well, anything is possible. That's what my law teacher used to say to me. Anything is possible, Howard, he would say, but is it probable? That is the question you've got to ask. So it's really hard to imagine how thieves could have hoodwinked the Roman guard that was outside the tomb. It's hard to make sense of that. Moreover, why would they leave the grave closed but take the body? That's a bit strange in itself. But also, what would be their motive? It doesn't make sense. Particularly because an empty tomb on its own proves nothing. An empty tomb is like corroboration evidence, it's supported evidence of having seen Jesus. If you've seen Jesus alive, then you would expect there to be an empty tomb. They work together. You can't take one away from the other in that sense. So imagine today we say Mormonism's founder, Joseph Smith, suddenly it's reported that his tomb is found empty. Are you going to rush to become a Mormon? I don't think so. What would you presume? That somebody had stolen his body. You'd need to actually see a sighting of him alive personally to convince you that he was still alive. Second theory, second alternative explanation is the apparent death theory or swoon theory. Now this is basically saying that people would argue that Jesus sort of fainted on the cross, that he just passed out on the cross. When he's in the tomb, he recuperates so that he can get out of the tomb, appear, present himself to his disciples, show them his scars. That's this apparent death or swoon theory. I think this is really far-fetched. Think about the evidence here. You've got a trial, mockery, you've then got flogging and scourging taking place, and then you've got crucifixion. Now, a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a great investigation into all of this, 1986, you can look it up for yourself. I've got a copy here if you want more information from the medical side. Says this, it says, scourging was intended to weaken the victim to a state just short of collapse or death. This is what happened to Jesus before he was even crucified. The whip that the Romans used, it had bits of metal and bone, sharp bone, woven into it, that they would whip you. And it said that this sometimes would happen, that your skin would be so opened up, it might reveal the spine itself. So you imagine the blood loss, the torture, the pain that Jesus is already in before he's been crucified. And then we know from the gospel accounts, very interesting detail that's put in, that the two men either side of Jesus who's crucified with him, that their legs are broken because the Jews want the bodies to be taken down before Passover comes. And so they're trying to rush and speed up the execution, but Jesus' legs are not broken. Now, you only break the legs of somebody who's on the cross if you want to speed up the process of asphyxiation, because that's what happens. You're on the cross. The only way you can breathe is if you push down on the nail between your feet, and they have actually discovered these crosses. They've dug them up archaeologically. They know they exist with 7-inch nails going through still wrists with bits of wood that are there. Then you have to push down on those nails to lift up in order to breathe out. You can't breathe out. What happens? Carbon dioxide builds up in your system. You get acidosis, get the beginnings of a heart attack, irregular heartbeat, and so forth. So they needed to break the legs to facilitate a faster death. But Jesus' legs didn't need to be broken, which suggests that he had already died on the cross. More than that, though, you've got Pilate making a decision that he needs to be sure about so that he's not embarrassed that Jesus really is dead. If he lets Jesus get down from that cross and he's not died, he is in trouble. His political authority is massively undermined. And then you have the testimony coming to him of a centurion who puts a spear into the side of Jesus and blood and water comes out. Which doesn't make sense at the time. Medically, no one would be able to understand that. But it makes sense if it's in the right side. It's a pericardial infusion that's built up around because of what's taking place in the heart attack. That's the water that's coming out together with the blood. It's a sign again that Jesus truly was dead. So, are we really to believe that after all this torturous pain, this scourging, this crucifixion, at least 36 hours inside an empty tomb with no food, no water, nothing to really help him recuperate, that here is Jesus, he's rolling away a stone. The stones were basically rolled down downhill, so on a slope, so it was much easier to roll the stone down, but to roll it back up, it was much harder. You had to get extra help. To do that, you needed more than just one person. But we're saying that Jesus comes out through this, manages to push this stone back on his own, get past the guards without them even noticing, and present himself to his disciples, despite all that's happened to him, how weak and weary he must have been. Surely, even if you accept this theory, that's what you're saying, weak and weary, he presents himself to his disciples in such a powerful way to make them believe that he has conquered death, that he has come through the grave. I don't know about you, but for me, I find that very hard to believe or to accept. The third and final alternative theory that I want to put forward is psychological phenomenon. Psychological phenomenon. People explain the resurrection just by a basis of hallucination. Now, unlike really most, if not all hallucinations, this wasn't an individual hallucination that was taking place. It was a collective experience. So the same hallucination is taking place for more than 500 people at one time. And for many others in different settings, the same hallucination. Now, you know, I'm sure as medical students, that hallucinations are very hard things for other people to induce externally to make somebody have a hallucination, but also they're to do with the individual's mind and makeup and their mentality. Hallucination is very unique to the individual, and yet the same collective experience is happening for all these people, the same hallucination. Now, even if they were hallucinating, you still have to explain why was the tomb empty, where is the body? And also, hallucinations don't account for why Paul, who was hostile to Jesus being raised from the dead, the whole Christian faith, he was hostile to that. How did he decide to accept it? How did he accept it? He wasn't filled with grief. He wasn't filled with emotion at that point. He didn't care about that. He was hostile. So this hallucination doesn't make sense for Paul. So in conclusion then, the resurrection basically changed disciples like Peter's fear into courage. It changed the skeptic James's doubt into faith. It changed Saul of Tarsus, who was a persecutor, into Paul, who was a proclaimer of the gospel. It changed the Friday Sabbath that the Jews celebrated into a Sunday celebration. It stopped the sacrifices taking place for Christians. They no longer needed to do sacrifices as part of the Jewish system. There was one sacrifice once for all, Jesus Christ on the cross now, so they no longer engaged in sacrifice. It changed a remnant of Jews into the Christian church, despair into hope. And I would say as well that the resurrection, it has changed my life. And indeed, it can change your life as well. It changes everything. Why? Because it really means that Jesus is God. If he came back from the dead, he is God. And that means he's alive. That means that there is the hope of life beyond the grave. That means there is the hope that we have purpose and meaning in this life, right here, right now. He says to one of the thieves who's been crucified on his side, who places faith in him, he says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." There is the hope of paradise because of the resurrection, and only because of the resurrection for those who believe in Jesus. So in conclusion then, I say that the best explanation of the evidence, I believe, is that Jesus really did rise from the dead.
First question then. Any reason why Jesus wouldn't appear to the priests who condemned him? That would solve half the problem.
It's an interesting question, and it's a question I have to say I've not come across before in my reading, but it's an interesting one. So the Sanhedrin, the priests who condemned him, what would happen if one of the appearances was to them? Okay, so I think I would go back and just simply say it's hard to speculate about those who he didn't appear to, but we do have solid evidence about those he did appear to. So why differentiate between a priest and all of those that he's already appeared to as well? Why are you saying that a priest's evidence is more valuable than, say, those who are also hostile like Paul? So you've got to still deal with the evidence. It doesn't get you around dealing with the evidence that's already there, that I've already presented, and various arguments for that. But also it could simply be that Jesus had an approach when he came to truth, that there were certain individuals who were so resistant, so hostile in their hearts, so blind already that he wouldn't give them the truth. A great example of that would be King Herod. when Jesus is accused before him and Herod is trying to interrogate him, Jesus gives him no answer at all. Why? I believe, you may argue with me, that he didn't think this man was worthy of the truth. He'd had every opportunity, particularly through the preaching of John the Baptist, about what was going on, to repent, to turn from his ways, but he resisted. And so there are some people, no matter what evidence you may present to them, they'll almost be always blinded to the truth. Because, as I said right at the start, they're wearing the wrong worldview. So he may have appeared to a priest, it's a hypothetical. I don't even know whether they would accept the evidence of that, because it would be the same if an alien genuinely did appear and walk into this room. Would you accept the evidence of that because you're so hostile towards it taking place? So that's how I'd go about it.
Why should I adjust my life because a man from history, even if he did rise from the dead?
It's a really good and important question. So if Jesus really did rise from the dead, let's accept that, even if you don't agree with that, that's your presupposition. He did rise from the dead. What does it mean? It means, as I said, that he is God, because he predicted this would happen. It was prophesied about him that he would die, and it did. It came fulfilled. No one that we know has ever been raised from the dead. They might get resuscitated, things like that, but to actually come through death. And that means that death is a problem that we all face. What will happen when you die is very significant. I don't know if you've thought about that. Where will you go? What will happen to your body? What will happen to your soul? But here, Jesus is giving a hope that death can be defeated. And so it's worth checking out his claims. What else does he say about himself? It's worth looking into him and exploring him more. Because this is true, find out more about him. Go and read books about him. Read the gospel accounts where he says he's making claims to be God himself in human flesh, able to deal with the problem of sin, which is ultimately what death is the sentence for. Death is a punishment for sin. It enters the world because of our rebellion against God. And Jesus is paving a way, breaking open our hope to escape that judgment so that we can have an eternal life with him. And that changes everything, as I said, about the way you live. It gives you hope. There's a great quote by a man called Tolstoy in a chapter in Tim Keller's book, The Reason for God. And he talks about, how can I live? What's the point in living? Because everything I do today will be destroyed at the point of death. Death is the great destroyer of everything in the world. Why should I go on living? And he discovers it's because of the hope of the resurrection. It means that there is life beyond the grave. It makes this life totally meaningful and purposeful in how you live.